the whole nature of faith has to do with the imagination. In a sense, imagination is the engine that makes it run. And that eyes of the heart is, I would say, nothing more, nothing less than the imagination.
Hello, and welcome to the Imaginative Discipleship podcast. Be transformed by the renewing of your imagination. I'm Caleb Woodbridge, your host, and I'm really excited to be kicking off this podcast with an exploration of what is the imagination with Ted Turnau. Hi, Ted.
Hey.
Ted, do you want to just introduce yourself a little bit and say a bit about your background in terms of thinking about and writing on pop culture and on imagination from a Christian perspective? Basically, explain why have I asked you to talk about this subject?
Sure. Well, my name is Ted Turnau, and my wife and I live in Prague, Czech Republic, where I teach at Anglo-American University. I teach in cultural studies and media studies and religious studies and sociology of religion and social theory and stuff like that. A lot of all the cool subjects are mine. And I have been fascinated, ever since I was a kid with popular culture and imagination. I was just always into something, whether it was tracking down a Beatles song when I was in middle school, or Doctor Who when I was in seminary, or Monty Python. I'm assuming most of you guys are British. There were some American, things as well, and we're quite into Japanese animation and anime and things like that. But I got a Ph.D. in apologetics at Westminster Theological Seminary, and my dissertation was on Paul Ricoeur. The title was Reimagining Ricoeur, Popular Culture as Text, Metaphor, and Narrative, which tried to, through engaging this, engaging this philosopher of language, a French philosopher of language named Paul Ricoeur, to sort of sketch out a theological approach to popular culture. And one of my seminary friends, after reading my dissertation, said, "Yeah, this is great stuff once you get it into a form that people could actually understand it, idiot." So, and that became many years later Popologetics, after, doing stuff with a youth group that I was pastoring. There it is.
Yeah, I've got my copy here. And I think one of the things that you do really well is to sort of you've got that depth and background, but you communicate things clearly. My wife was reading this recently, and she was saying, "Oh, it's so nice, it's so clear." So I think you've done that work of translation really, really well. So
it took me years to sort of, I had all of this theory in my head, and it really took me years of putting it into practice, talking about popular culture with high schoolers and middle schoolers, to actually figure out what the cash value was of all of that theory I had. And now I'm glad I did it. And then after I wrote Popologetics, more recently got together with two guys named E. Stephen Burnett and Jared Moore, a pastor and a guy who runs a website about Christian popular culture. And we did the Pop Culture Parent, which is basically Popologetics, but aimed at the developmental concerns of little kids. How do you do popular cultural apologetics with little kids, or with middle schoolers, or with high schoolers and college students? So, but all of this, so both of those books are about how are we as Christians supposed to think about and talk about and relate to our non-Christian friends and neighbors over non-Christian popular culture, or what I later called forming a critical imagination, a Christian critical imagination. It was always supposed to be part of Popologetics way back in 2012. I originally meant for there to be a second part of that book on how do we create things, a creative Christian imagination. How do we create things and put them out there? Because it's not enough to just say, yeah, that show's cool, but it's got idolatry. But let's talk about it, as if that ends our engagement with culture. We ought to be, as a community, putting stuff out there.
Yeah.
But as I got more and more into it, and originally Popologetics was like 550 pages, and I sent the manuscript to a publisher which shall remain nameless to protect the innocent, and they sent back a rejection letter, but they said, you know what, nobody's going to nobody's going to publish a 550 page book from a first time author. Nobody does that. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, you actually have two books here. You would be advised to split them and do two books. And I was like, oh, he's right. And so I split them. One became Popologetics, and the other I just started kind of picking at over the next 10 years, and it just grew and grew and grew. Because the imagination is a wildly complicated subject, one which I don't know that the church is really all that well versed in. I certainly wasn't, and and it kind of led me on all these interesting explorations, and and then I pitched a book to, or Caleb got wind of the book and said, "Hmm, got to get on top of this," and so now it's due out in July 2023, unless I miss deadlines and the sky falls or Jesus comes back first or something. So yeah, that's sort of where I come from. I'm sort of
Yeah.
quasi fanboy, and the power of popular culture to engage the imagination is just something that really fascinates me, and the religious meaning of that
Hmm.
really fascinates me.
Yeah.
So that's sort of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, this is probably a good point to sort of then explain my trajectory and how this has ended up intersecting with what you're doing. so,
Sure,
so,
sure.
so I think, and particularly what how it fits with what I'm wanting to explore on this podcast. But yeah, I think it's interesting. You sort of talk about the critical imagination and the creative imagination. I think when I was a university student, I sort of read The Purpose-Driven Life. It sort of encouraged you to sort of come up with your a sort of mission statement type thing. And what I came up
Right.
with that
And it can't be seashells.
got-
No seashells.
yeah, taking on board John Piper, but
Oh, that's
the
right. Purpose driven life is Rick Warren, right?
yeah,
Not Piper. Oh, okay,
that's
okay. Sorry.
don't waste your life. But I read
Right.
that as well. I'm sure. But what I came up with, maybe slightly pretentiously, but it's stood me in good stead, is that I feel called to engage critically and creatively with culture for Christ, and to equip other people to do the same. And
Yeah,
I think
we've got the similar job description.
yeah, um, and lots of similarities in terms of interest. Like I ran a Doctor Who podcast, Impossible Podcasts, for 5 years from 2008 to 13. So sort of later Tennant and early Smith era. So yeah, I think Doctor Who is something I've thought a lot about, the theological meaning of Doctor Who. I love that T-shirt for those listening on the audio. It's a Beatles style zebra crossing with the silhouettes of
Abbey Road,
different doctors. Yeah,
including my two favorite, Tom Baker and David Tennant, is a close second.
Yeah, and our paths have actually crossed before. We did get a random drink in Paddington Station once, which was funny back in the day, just from interacting on Twitter. And you were around when I was working in London, so I sort of knew about you and knew that you're doing good stuff in this sort of area. But yeah, and recently I've been doing stuff under the banner of Bigger on the Inside on my newsletter, sort of thinking about imagination and discipleship and the sort of
and the TARDIS.
Yeah. Well, it's got the dual. Well, it's got multiple levels of meaning. There's the TARDIS, there's the wardrobe to Narnia, and then there's the way in which stories are sort of bigger on the inside in terms of the worldviews and ideas and stuff they contain. Yeah, exploring that. But I think one of the running threads has been imaginative discipleship, and that's what the podcast is focusing on. Is I think slightly more with a focus on the place that imagination plays in spiritual formation, because I've become increasingly interested just in the place that the imagination has in the Christian life more broadly. I think there's obviously a apologetic value in terms of being able to engage well with culture as a way of listening to our neighbours, loving our neighbours by listening to their stories and being able to give a good response to that. But I think there's also something about particularly drawing on James K. Smith and his work on sort of the You Are What You Love and his Cultural Liturgies trilogy, just how much our hearts are shaped by the imagination and by both the stories and the sort of rituals, the cultural liturgies that have an impact on us. And yeah, I think there's lots that's interesting in that. And so I think but yeah, while I was sort of doing my own thinking and writing on some aspects of that, in my day job as IVP Publishing Director, where I do some commissioning and editing, your Popologetics Part 2, the sort of Oasis of Imagination book, landed on my desk by your agent, and I was like, oh wow, Ted's light years ahead in terms of you've gone so much further in sort of giving lots of real deep thought to the imagination. But yeah, I could see that I'm really excited about that book, just in terms of, I think it's will your angle is particularly around that creative imagination about Christians making art, doing good art. What does that look like? And I think that's wonderful and important. I hope will help be a launch pad for lots of good Christian creativity. But I also think there's ways in which the thinking you've done around imagination in a slightly more abstract way, it also is a helpful springboard for going in slightly different directions, such as the sort of imagination and informing then questions of discipleship and formation. So I think you've I'm editing it at the moment. It's a work in progress. And I should also mention that this podcast is very much a personal project. So anything I say here is not necessarily the opinion of IVP. So
So don't sue.
usual caveats apply if my colleagues or bosses at IVP in this PCK group are listening. It's like personal time hat, but one of the nice things about the job that I get to do is just the overlap it has in terms of fitting with that strong sense of calling and being able to be doing in a professional capacity, just working through some of this stuff and helping to platform good creative Christian thinking and engagement with culture, stuff that's well rooted in the Bible and is then equipping the church. So I feel very privileged to be in a position to be doing that and to be working in Christian publishing in that capacity. It's lots of fun. It has its challenges, but there's a real overlap in terms of what makes my faith tick and what I get to do for my day job. So that's how this has glided together. And so so we've been chatting about some. Well, we haven't done a lot of chatting about the book yet. I'm sort of working on the editorial notes at the moment, and the sort of probably more of the conversation will come off the back of me finishing those and sending them back. But I think we're this is an opportunity to sort of chew the fat in a more informal, free-ranging way without worrying that I'm wasting work time, sort of just chasing up some of the rabbit trails. So we'll see where the conversation goes. I hope this will be a useful one for our listeners, as well as fun for us to chat about. Should we dive into just the question of, I guess people might think Christian imagination, imaginative discipleship, isn't that just a bit weird and random? Isn't that just a bit of a distraction for Christians? There's a bit of a sense of suspicion about the imagination in terms of it's perhaps seen as something that's, well, you don't want to get too imaginative because we're holding on to the truth, and that's the important thing, and we don't want to be making stuff up that isn't true. So
right.
How would you sort of begin to maybe explain or define or start unpacking the imagination in a way that sort of goes, oh, actually this is something Christians should care about?
I would say I would steal a line from one of my co-authors, Ruth Naomi Floyd. We're working on a book together. And she likes to say, before God was a redeemer, he was an artist. That is, at the very get-go of the book, of the whole Bible, God's doing creative work, right? He's a creator before he's a redeemer. And I would add, and if you take a really careful look at his redemption, and the way Jesus wrought redemption and brought beauty out of ugliness, brought life out of death, that's a really creative act as well. It's a strange creative act because there's so much destruction involved, like the death of God's beloved Son. But out of that came life, peace, shalom, grace, all of that sort of stuff. It's so I would say, if you don't understand the whole of the Christian faith as as an immense act of the imagination, of the divine imagination, then you're misunderstanding the Christian faith. If you are so afraid of the imagination that you think God did this by rote, that he was just kind of like, oh, those humans. All right, let's see what I can do. Flips through a recipe book. All right, add one Jesus and stir in some Holy Spirit and give death. And I mean, that's not how it. That would be kind of, borderline blasphemy, which is why I'm saying it as a hypothetical. Not that I actually believe that. Um, so that's the first thing. Is that the is that imagination lies at the foundation of of the Christian faith, of the nature of the Christian
Yeah,
faith.
God as creator
Um,
and created.
God as creator and redemption as creation. Redemption is imaginative revitalization. New creation is got to be
Yeah,
creativity, right? And that's where everything's headed. The other thing is, I would say that especially in an increasingly secular world, and I know this because I live in atheist central Prague, Czech Republic, which has the reputation of being one of the most secularized cities in the world. Um, and London and the UK and Cardiff and all of it is not that far behind, right? UK is a little bit different um, than Czech, um, but we are definitely in a post-Christian age, right? Christianity no longer has the kind of cultural punch it once had, no longer holds the sway or authority it once had. And in that setting, especially in that setting, but in every setting, in order to, in order for faith to be healthy, to apprehend the object of faith, which is Christ Himself, which is God, you've got to use imagination, right? Because last time I looked, God wasn't literally an old man sitting on a cloud that you could look up and wave at and say, it's you it's seeing beyond what is seen. It is faith grasping the unseen, right? That's Hebrews. Faith is being sure of what we don't see. And so um I would say the whole nature of faith has to do with the imagination. In a sense, imagination is the engine that makes it run. In the beautiful prayer that Paul gives in Ephesians 3, in Ephesians 3:8, he calls, he says, and I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened,
yeah,
that you may know, all of this wonderful stuff that you've been called to. And that eyes of the heart is, I would say, nothing more, nothing less than the imagination learning to see past what the world gives us, learning to see past your own disappointments, your own stumbling, your own failures, your own sins, to know God still loves me, there's still grace for me. Or seeing past your successes when you're tempted to get arrogant and saying, no, I'm still a sinner in need of Christ's blood every day. So I would say, number one, the whole Christian faith is all about redemption. Number two, I'm sorry, is all about imagination. And number two, you got to use imagination even to be a Christian these days, like you did in first century, Roman Empire, for sure. Um, and um, and I would say number three, a failure of imagination, lack of imagination in Christians tends to result on a kind of religion that's folded in on itself, that majors on the minors, that looks at haircuts and says that's a Christian and that's not, rather than the texture of the whole life. Why? Because imagination is so important for developing empathy for people who are very different than you. Um, it's important for understanding that the world could be different, and so it's foundational for hope. It's foundational for resistance to social injustice or racism or any of these things. If you give that up, then you're just kind of passing the time. You're just like hunkered down and saying, okay, I'm going to be faithful. Just tell me when it's over. Wake me up when they carry me out in the casket. I'll do my best to pass on my faith to my loved ones and to my children and grandchildren, but don't get me mixed up in any of that craziness.
Yeah.
Imagination is a call to the craziness and a call to engage it with a confidence that doesn't shrink back the way that a lot of Christians tend to do.
Yeah. So, so I think, yeah, just to uh, pick up on that, because I think it's that sort of it's a very different understanding of faith to the sort of there's the classic critique from Marx and so on of religion being the opiate of the people. It's a sort of escape from the harsh realities, and so the imaginative side is sort of mere escapism. And I
Mm.
think uh, there can be something in that for certain types of Christianity, for certain theologies that have lost sight of perhaps the transforming impact that um, uh, the Christian faith should have on this world. Because I think if you are just sitting around waiting to be sort of raptured away to heaven as somewhere else type thing, then there is something missing there in terms um, uh, of that new creation hope that God is redeeming and restoring this, and so
Right.
that's really important in terms of making sure that yeah, we're connecting Christ's redemptive work to the whole of life and to the world as it is now. It's not just
Yeah,
pie in the
and that
sky when you die.
right. And that I think one of the things that's really kind of impressed me and popped out to me when I was doing research for this book is how closely tied imagination is to eschatology,
mm,
to the doctrine of the last things. um, because I'm reading this book, which I wish I had read like 5 years ago, but it didn't exist 5 years ago, by Jim Davies, just called Imagination, which kind of goes through the neuroscience of
mm,
imagination. It's really an education in itself. Not a Christian, but just saying this is what we know about the way the brain processes information and how you turn visual information into these categories and abstract things and meaning. and what and what he says at the very beginning is that the imagination is sort of um, anticipatory. It, it's
mm,
it it sort of gives you a view of the way of what you expect or of what you're expecting,
mm-hmm,
of your hopes, your all of that sort of stuff. And it seems to me that if you've got a lousy eschatology, that is, if your hopes for the future is that God's going to pluck you out of this earth and take you to a fluffy, cloudy heaven where you will play a harp forever and ever, and kind of detach yourself from this world, then that's going to introduce a sort of imaginative stagnation,
mm,
and a sort of a it's a positive disincentive for engaging the world with any sort of imagination. And for that sort of eschatology, Marx actually may be right. There may be a bunch of Christians who are just like, oh, get me out of here. My life may really be hard now, but at least I've got this pie in the sky by and by, that if I'm a good little boy or girl and I don't rock the boat, then I will certainly be plucked away,
yeah,
and Jesus will take me. If you've got the kind of an imagination that is very grounded, in an eschatology that says, no, 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 God's going to come and renew this world so that what we do here now matters, then it's not pie in the sky by and by. It's pie that's baking right here, right now, and I'm in the middle of it. And therefore, if I see something wrong with the pie, I need to go and address that, right? I can't shrink back and say, oh, well, later it'll be all be fixed. It's like, no, 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 no. This is what this um, this very well may carry on into the new creation. I really like Ali Gordon's artist Ali Gordon's phrase about art being windows to the new creation.
Yeah.
That the artist's job is to clear those windows. I think that's everybody's job in one way or another. I think artists do it in a particularly visual, vivid, auditory, sensual way
Yeah.
that I love. But it's all
So
about it's all about which future you're tied to, which is what shapes the hope that your imagination engages in.
yeah,
If that makes sense.
yeah, I think that's great. I love Valley's book, Why Art Matters, also available from IVP, so
IVP.
obligatory plug. But yeah, I think how we think about the future is a good example, and yeah, this is perhaps a good uh, worked example in terms of fleshing out what you say when actually we need imagination in order to have faith, because if you sort of strip imagination back, if you give a sort of fairly technical definition, it's sort of that ability to hold things that aren't immediately present to the senses uh, in our mind. And so it's the whole thing of faith is the assurance of things
Things unseen.
unseen, things hoped for. And so before we can even believe or disbelieve something, we need to be able to hold it in our minds, to be able to imagine it in order to have grasped it and understood it. And so
Right.
imagination is that first step of understanding something, out of which then arises the possibility of faith, of believing believing that thing, of setting your heart on that thing. And that's true
Yeah.
also of our present relationship with God, because we do live in that now and not yet. If we've got God's Spirit in us, but we don't see Jesus face to face as we will then. So um, there's a sense in which we need to be able to imagine Jesus, and that doesn't mean we're fooling ourselves, but in the same way that we, when we're apart from a loved one and we might read a letter or sort of engage with them through a phone call or video, we're our imagination allows us to sort of make them more fully present to us than is actually the case by the senses. And when that's reflective of some reality, then that's not just an illusion or fantasy, that's actually building a bridge, it's making a connection.
Yeah. Yeah. And the imagination is all about bridges, all about making connections. Another thing that that lacking imagination will create in the church is, I think, a really um, a kind of a cruelty, almost a lack of compassion
Mm.
for people who are different, because imagination is essential for empathy, right? Um, what does it mean? How does it feel to be, let's say, a homosexual person who's fighting desires that they're not able to control fully, and they've made their life a mess, or maybe they're very successful, and how do I relate to that person? How do I relate to a person who's dyed his hair blue and is wearing all sorts of outlandish, things, outlandish clothes, and how do I relate to him as I must as a Christian, because they're made in the image of God. They still have this inherent dignity and worth. Um, when I was in high school, I was heavily into Pink Floyd. That was sort of my band, and in the Wall, if you remember, towards the end, Roger Waters sings about, the bleeding hearts and artists, kind of
Mm.
marching up and down in front of his wall that he's constructed brick by brick, and that's the whole tragic metaphor of the wall. and and I mean, I don't take my theological cues from Roger Waters necessarily, but this idea that artistic creativity is somehow connected to a heart that bleeds for other people, a heart that is open and feels other people's pain and is sensitive to their needs and can speak into their situation with insight and winsomeness. I think that's really suggestive that imagination is necessary if you're going to love someone who's different from you. It doesn't take imagination to love a person who's just like me, because we already vibe. We already
Mm.
have a thing. It takes a lot of, it takes more patience, patient imaginative work to relate to that trans kid in my class who is dealing with all sorts of emotional stuff. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, I mean, it just gets you into very murky water and asks you to navigate that murky water in love for the person that you're relating to. I'm sorry, there's a siren going by. I don't know if you can hear that.
Yeah.
Um, and I think evangelicals don't like murky waters.
Yeah.
They don't like difficult, messy, uh, potentially painful things that require patience and don't have a really cut and dried how to, right?
Yeah, I think good art embraces the sort of complexities of life and of particular people and their situations in a way
And a
that,
fallen existence.
yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
uh, on the other hand, I think bad art, and there's often the temptation for um, sort of self-consciously Christian art to fall into this trap, is to try and make everything overly tidy, the sort of the simple white hats and black hats, and it sort of
yep,
shuts down empathy by sort of simplifying or demonizing or stereotyping another, rather than giving the complexity of helping us understand people who are different from us, but also share so much in terms of shared humanity in the image of God in us all.
yep. There was I did an interview for the book with an actress who asked to be remain nameless, because some people in Hollywood freak out at the name Christian, and she was in a Christian film that was sort of a date night gone wrong, and the house is on fire and the kids are in danger, and the car crashes, and she's just getting more and more stressed as the movie goes on. And then there's this sort of moment of clarity in which this tattooed biker dude, who's not a Christian, was raised Christian but isn't a Christian, comes in and sort of gives wisdom and says, "Look, I was raised Christian. I'm not Christian anymore, but aren't you guys supposed to like trust God and lean into his providence and not freak out so much?" Or something like that. I can't remember exactly the details, but he ends up giving, I mean, it's sort of this cheesy Okay, here's the moral, here's the lesson. But she had to fight the movie studio in order to have those words spoken by a non-Christian, because of course only Christians have wisdom, and we all know that. There was a blog I read, and this I think did make it into the book, where this screenwriter for one of the major Christian movie studios wrote a screenplay which got made into a movie, um, and in it there are different Christians, and they have their different foibles, and one woman in particular has is a real gossip and real critical, condescending, sort of just an unpleasant person, and it's sort of a comedy of manners, and she gets her comeuppance and whatever. But after that, because it didn't test well with Christian audiences, the producers of the studio made a blanket rule: no longer shall we have Christian characters written that have any character flaws. Only good things. Christians can only have virtues. None of that. I'm like, okay, that may test well because it's a security blanket for us. We like to
Yeah.
see ourselves or our tribe looking good, but that's not at all realistic to the messiness. I mean, ask any pastor if there are sinners within your church, whether there are people who struggle with different sins that are really annoying within your church.
Well,
It's
there's a sort of dishonesty about that. It's not truthful to the way the world is. It's not truthful to sort of biblical teachings about there's no one righteous, not even one. That we all have that conflict within us, even as we're redeemed as Christians. We're still
well,
locked in that
and
struggle with sin.
it's a betrayal of the Christian faith in that it does a very clever grace-ectomy
Mm.
and
Yeah.
removes the necessity for grace from the center of the Christian faith. And where you have a graceless Christianity, you will have an oversimplified uh, vision of life that lacks imagination and has no tolerance for mess.
Mm.
Now, I wouldn't say let's go all the way to the other side and let's just allow mess to the nth degree, right? There is a call to discipleship for following after Jesus. But I don't know about you or your listeners, but for me, that looks like, stumbling steps and slow.
Mm.
That looks like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 4 steps backward, 2 steps forward. Um, and uh, and if we don't serve a gracious God, my goose is cooked,
Yeah.
right?
So
And go ahead.
yeah. So just to push it. So we've talked about how it can go wrong or be done badly. Are there some examples of how imagination has helped you in your Christian walk, in your growth as a disciple? Can you think of whether it's stories or music or other works of art, or maybe particular practices that have gone, oh yeah, this has in some way helped me and renewed me in my faith and helped me grow.
Um, so as I have aged, I have had to take up some exercise, or else I just grow horizontally at an alarming rate. So every morning, with the exception of maybe the weekends, um, I go out for a walk, 30-40 minute walk with my little. They've got rubber tips on them, but they're basically ski poles. It's called alpine walking here in Czech Republic, and I will use that as a chance to pray, and I'll start off with the Lord's Prayer, and then I will go into some praise. Just choose an aspect of God and praise Him for it. And that sounds like normal, everyday, yeah, this is what you do. But it's amazingly hard for somebody who's grown up as a Christian to have my imagination gripped
Mm.
by something about God, because I'm like, heard it, you know, bought the T-shirt, been around it for years and years and years. And so the beginning of my prayers is always sort of an imaginative struggle. How can I praise God for His eternity in a way um, that will please Him and that will remind me of how great He is? How can I get to His glory? How can I get to His justice? How can I get to His love? How can I get to His goodness? And what sort of images can I draw upon? And that's hard imaginative work. And one of the things that I'm hopeful that this is training my imagination, because one of the things that I keep bumping up against is my absolute poverty of imagination when I'm doing that. It's like I'm speaking with a stammering tongue. I don't, there's it's very different than writing an analytical piece. It's just um, I'm not naturally given to poetry.
Mm.
Um, and what so what I'm looking for are pieces of art that will help me, that will give me ammo to
Yeah.
fire heavenward um, in my praises. Not that, but see that here's the thing: there is so much Christian popular culture that is so steeped in cheese and cliche
Yeah.
that it poisons the well, right? So, and I don't want to rag on viewers who are who they just listen to CCM all day long. They listen to the contemporary Christian music stations or whatever, and they find great solace in that. I don't want to come down too hard on them. Um, I want to come down on them a little bit, but I don't want to come down too hard on them. But what I'm looking for a tired imagination like mine, what I'm looking for is something that comes out of the blue and grabs me by the shirt collar and just shakes me, just kind of wake up, and I'm like, oh, what was that? What was that? Because there are certain trails my mind has gone down when it deals with God that I've gone down 100,000 times before. I need somebody. Good preaching does this. A good preacher tells you what you sort of already know, but tells it boomerang style, kind of throws it past you, and you're like, "What?" And then it hits you in the back of your head, and you're like,
Yeah.
"Wow." That kind of imaginative indirection that
Yeah.
it can come with a good story or whatever. Let me.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis talked about with the Narnia books how it allowed him to sneak past the watchful dragons of over-familiarity. And I think it's interesting because there's probably the same imaginative indirection is needed both to um, uh, get past Christians' over familiarity, but also to bridge the complete lack of familiarity with that.
Or the faux familiarity.
Yeah, that secular people have,
Yeah.
where they've either got no understanding or sort of negative preconceptions, and
Yes.
and so
So faux in the sense of FAUX
yeah.
and FOE, both.
But in both those cases, that boomerang
Yeah.
indirection is needed to be able to let the truth sneak around and sort of whack you over the head with its beauty and with its something striking.
And the wonderful thing about art and the way art informs the imagination, um, I don't, I mean, for those who will read the book, I don't agree with Jamie Smith on everything,
Yeah.
but I do think that there is a powerful way that that imagination is formed, that's pre-verbal, that's precognitive, that sets you down in something that's not easy to articulate. Um, so a couple of stories. Um, one is we do movie nights, movie discussion
Mm.
nights at my house, and one movie we saw long time ago, about 15, 17 students were at our house, and it was called A Love Song for Bobby Long. Nobody knows this movie. John Travolta, early ScarJo, and Scarlett Johansson plays this young woman whose mother dies, and she goes to New Orleans to claim this house that she's inherited, and finds that there's squatters there. A couple of guys, or three guys, who are living there, and they, instead of calling the police and kicking them out, they form this kind of idiosyncratic community. And one of the leading uh, homeless guys is a guy named Bobby Long, played by John Travolta, who used to be an English professor at Tulane University, but because he was an alcoholic and had a predilection for romantic sexual trysts with his students, um, caused scandal. His son was supposed to walk home from baseball practice, and he was supposed to pick him up, but he was with a student, um, and so the kid walked home himself and got hit by a car and died, and that cost him his job and his marriage, and he's now a ruined person. And um, and after this film, I said to my students, do you see why Christians would want to reserve sex for a committed married relationship? And the response was fury. Like, I could have thrown a hand grenade and got a less violent response. Everybody was like on me at once, like, how you're such a dinosaur, blah, 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 blah. How dare you, what about friends with benefits, what about blah, blah, blah. And there were a couple of other Christians there, and they kind of sunk down in their seats and were like, you got yourself into this, buddy, we're not coming to your rescue. And it was not what I call a productive discussion. So I kind of filed that away and thought about it. And then the next semester, we did a smaller group called a sort of a discussion series, which we did fortnightly, called Meaning of. And we'd have a sit down dinner, and then we'd do a little reading, and we talk about the meaning of meaning, or the meaning of work, or the meaning of recreation. And one of them was the meaning of sex and romance and marriage, or sex and romance and love.
Mm.
And I showed a movie, 90-minute movie, by my favorite European director, Krzysztof Kieślowski, called A Short Film About Love, um, which I think is one of the most powerful presentations of the reality of a spiritual aspect to love, that it's not just about sex.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if any of your listeners have watched it, I mean, it's not an easy movie to watch, and it's a little complicated because Kieślowski didn't say he was a Christian, but he brings a lot of Christian sensibilities, and I would argue a Christian imagination, into this this very kind of this story about a very messed up young man who's in love with a neighbor who lives across the way, spies on her, um, and she finds out, and she tries to convince him that that love is simply sex, right? And I can't do this without spoiling the movie, and I don't want to do that. But but I showed this movie in which Kieślowski very strongly um, implies there is a lot more going on to love, and it's so easy to betray love. And after that, I said, okay, so what did you guys think of the movie? What do you think it says about sex and love? Can you understand maybe why Christians would want to keep sex in marriage? And the reaction was completely different, because they had to sit in the presence of a young man who's struggling to figure out love, and this cynical woman who's trying to destroy his belief in love. And all of a sudden it was just a very they were forced to deal with the meaning of sex and the meaning of love in a way they never had to before.
Yeah.
Which is which I think is an amazing testimony to the power of a Christian imagination. The second story is this past summer, like um, a month or so ago. I was in Amherst, Massachusetts,
Mm-hmm.
and I was asked by a local Christian group, an apologetics ministry called Vertical 101, and they asked if I could do a series of talks about imagination and creative cultural engagement.
Yeah, great.
And so I did my talks, and it was also online. There were some people joining us, including a pastor in a church that we were going to be visiting later on, and he texted me on my phone, on my mobile phone, and said, "Yeah, I really liked the first couple of talks, and I liked your third talk, but your examples, I just didn't find them helpful at all, because I did some case studies. I played some 21 Pilots for them, and if you don't know 21 Pilots, uh, they're Christian, but they don't record on a Christian label, and their fan base is predominantly, I would say, non-Christians. Um,
Yeah.
and
So
uh,
is musicians, is that a band, or I've not come across them?
you've not come across 21 Pilots?
No.
Dylan.
I'll check. I'll check them out.
They are okay. Okay. To be fair, I didn't know about them either. I used to, once upon a time, teach at Union School of Theology
Yeah, yeah.
in Bridgend, Wales, and one of my assignments there was I taught a module there called Popular Culture and Christian Worldview, and one of the assignments was I presented what I thought was a a normative vision for what Christian creative cultural engagement and imagination should be. And then I said, go find one of these and write up an analysis,
Yeah.
4 or 5 pages. And so basically I would send, every other year when I taught there, I would send out my minions, and they would go scour the landscape, and they would bring me back things. And 21 Pilots was one of those. But 21 Pilots is likely the biggest band you've never heard of. They've got a huge fan base, and Tyler Joseph, who is the singer songwriter,
Yeah,
he
yeah.
writes the songs.
I'm looking them up now on my iPad.
Yeah. I mean, their YouTube videos have got bajillion hits and so forth. But Tyler Joseph kind of came up in this big mega church in Ohio, and he and Josh Dunn, who's the drummer, just start creating this music. And Tyler struggles with anxiety and depression, and so a lot of his songs have to do about that. That's been a major focus of their songs, and it's not. And their aesthetic is not easy listening. It's not CCM. It's kind of disturbing. It sort of shakes you by the shirt collar, like I was talking about. Um, and and so this pastor was saying, I didn't find those uh, I didn't find those examples very helpful at all. And I was like, oh, great. I'm going to go. I was scheduled to do a shortened version of the talk at his church later. So I was like, great. I'm going to have to sit and listen to an older pastor lecture me about the evils of popular culture again. And, but I didn't hear from him. And then we finally got to this little church outside of Charlottesville. And I did my talk. And then we got to the case studies where we're going to talk through some examples. And I said, is it okay if I play 21 Pilots, looking at the pastor? And he said, yeah, please. Like, that's odd. Why is he saying that? And so I played some, and the people in the church were like, had different reactions. And then the pastor spoke and he said, look, I want to tell you what God's been doing. I went to spend some time with a young woman who is struggling, and this guy's got a huge pastor's heart, super duper compassionate. I went to spend some time with this young woman who's struggling with anxiety and depression, and we just got to talking. I said, so what are you listening to? And she said, 21 Pilots. And he was like, really? Can you help me understand what it is that you see in that music? Because I have a hard time. And she said, well, when I listen to their music, I understand that they're down here with me, that they get me, they understand. In other words, um, they're being incarnational, in a sense, right? Jesus didn't stay up in heaven and say, you guys work it out yourself. He came down and in flesh and undertook the struggle of being human. Well, Tyler Joseph, who knows intimately these struggles, creates art which says, yeah, I'm one of you. I get it. You're feeling messed up, but let me give you something to encourage you and to bring forth, to kind of uh, underscore the struggle that I know that we share. So and that was hugely encouraging to me. I mean, I wouldn't call myself a 21 Pilots fan, but I definitely appreciate them.
Yeah.
And when we're on long road trips, they're going in the CD player. So yeah, so
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered your question about how do I I'm trying to, in my prayer life, because prayer takes
Yeah.
imagination. I'm trying to incorporate imagination into my prayer life. But I'm also trying to incorporate it in how we do movie nights. Um, and I'm always on the lookout for Christian art that's going to slap me up backside of the head. Right? It's going to boomerang me. Um, there is precious little out there, but there is some,
Yeah.
and it's better than when I was growing up in the church, where everybody had to have so many JPMs, Jesuses per minute, if your song was going to be considered a really Christian song.
Yeah.
So
Well,
so I would say to your listeners, go out and find the good stuff.
yeah. Great. No, I'll definitely check out. I've added those to my music library, so I'll give 21 Pilots a listen. I think just to mention a couple of that I've appreciated. I think my wife and I found that Angie Peterson's music really helped us through the sort of dark winter of lockdown, sort of winter before last, in terms of he is fairly explicitly Christian, but in a way that's kind of rougher around the edges and a bit more raw than I think mainstream Christian contemporary music usually is. And then another that we really appreciate is the Grey Havens. Come across them?
No. Are they sort of a folk band?
Yeah, a sort of folk duo.
Okay.
But they've got the thing I like about them is that they're very narrative led, and although there's sort of Christian themes, they're rarely it's they rarely will directly use Jesus or theological terms or sort of obvious. It's very sort of metaphorical or allegorical or other stuff in terms of how they approach things. But it's got a real sort of beauty to it. Lots of sort of inklings references woven into the
Yeah,
songs, sort
yeah.
of drawing a lot on sort of
I think somebody did a paper on that, so
yeah.
I have heard them.
So
Um,
so yeah, I think they're really nice just in terms of it is a bit more indirect, but there's a real beauty to the way they approach things. Um, yeah,
yeah.
so
Half Alive is also really good.
oh yeah,
Um, and I ought to give a shout out. I really enjoyed Josh Matthews' uh, EP. What's it called? Progress Nonetheless,
mhm.
which is sort of his take on Pilgrim's Progress.
Ah,
And I should note for just honesty in advertising that that Ewan, who produced the record, was one of my students at Union. So
yeah,
it's a little bit of nepotism, but it's really a fine album. And Josh has just a great. Uh, he's got a great sense of musicianship and got a great voice.
mm.
So
Great. Well, I think we'd better start drawing things to a close. But yeah, that's some great thoughts, and yeah, just maybe if we can round things off by um, looking ahead to Oasis of Imagination. So that's coming July next year. But yeah, what's your real prayer for the life of the church and the sort of impact that you hope your book will help have? What you want to see catalyzed? Um,
if I had a magic wand and could sweep it over the church in both the UK and the US and beyond, I would like to see sort of a reset of evangelicals thinking about cultural engagement and the imagination. Um, Instead of being so invested in the culture wars or so invested in creating safe spaces for us and our children, that we would be engaged in our culture in a way that's creative and healthy
mhm,
and allows for mess and grace and all the stuff we were talking about. I would like to see uh, I would like to see the conservative Christian church. I mean, theologically conservative, not necessarily politically conservative. Americans will know what I mean. Um, I would like to see them understand the imagination better than before. One of the central metaphors of this book that's coming out is the oasis that is creative works that uh, that Christians can plant that will open up a breathable space that allow non-Christians and Christians to come in and enjoy, and that resonates with their imaginations and challenges them and gives them a space to talk and wrestle through, basically, fan activity.
yeah.
Um, and um, and I would like to see the Christian church create conditions where people can come up and artistically gifted people can come up and start planting those. But I don't think that support of Christian artists exists just yet.
Mhm.
I mean, it does in some places, in some isolated pockets. There are some churches in the UK that do a good job at this, a rather good job. But the majority, I would say, of both the US and the UK church doesn't. Um, and what that does is it alienates the talented people who should be doing most to encourage Christians in spiritual formation, imaginative spiritual formation, um, in bridging, uh, making bridges to non-Christians, all of that sort of stuff. Um, so, for instance, in 21 Pilots, Tyler Joseph has been struggling in his faith. Like
Mm.
early on in his career, uh, it felt like he was much more convinced as a Christian. And as his career has progressed, and as he's been touring, and as he's continued to struggle with anxiety and depression, he's been, he still calls himself a Christian, but he struggles with what that means, and um, and struggles with how he perceives God not to have shown up in his struggle, and all of those things, which says to me that there is a gap in his pastoral life. Like, I don't know his church situation, but I would imagine if he's touring as much as he is, he's not getting to church, and nobody's making church come to him. And he is, and an artist on the road is isolated, and so and is under creative strain. And what are you going to produce for me now? And is this show going to be as good as the last show? And all of that. um, I would like to see the church become far more intentional about resourcing and supporting Christian artists, um, because they're the people who are resourcing us in terms of
Yeah.
spiritual formation, in terms of making these missional bridges. Uh, yeah. So, and my real, so all of those things, I would like to see that. I would like to see a discussion started in a lot of churches. If my book is a success, people will be talking about this stuff, and hopefully, um, changes will come about that I think will set us up better in the second half of the 21st century than we have been in the first half.
Yeah, great stuff. Yeah, no, I hope and pray that it can help move that along. I think there are some green shoots of different things going on. I know that there's the Morphe network, and there's things relating to Hutchmeet, and there's the Sputnik network and others. But yeah, it's very patchy. It's very easy to be quite distant from those. And if you are a artistically inclined Christian, sort of to fall through the cracks in terms of getting meaningful support. And I think that's that's to the loss both for those individuals, but also for the wider church in terms of benefiting from the creative gifts that God has given many people among us. So yeah.
Yeah, and even artistically inclined people who are not professional artists but want to be involved in the lives of artists.
Mm.
Um, I, yeah, I so Morphe's great, Hutchmoot's great. They're both not churches.
Yeah, yeah.
I would I would love to see the church as church be a network, that that uh, that Morphe can be doing consulting work with,
Mm.
you know, but um, I think, yeah, and the guys at Morphe say the same thing. Don't Artists, if you're getting frustrated with the church, don't leave the church, because you get detached from the church, and all of a sudden, your faith becomes very abstract, and kind of this empty signifier that doesn't mean much anymore.
Mm.
So, uh, anyway,
Yeah,
that's what I'd like to see happen.
yeah. It's trying to translate it into a movement that embeds itself into the organic life of the the everyday church rather than just being something that's happening in these networks on the sort of fringes. Yeah.
And I think as that happens, as those relationships happen, I think you will find evangelicals becoming less afraid of the imagination and more champions of the imagination.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well,
that's my theory.
Thanks very much, Ted. Thanks to our listeners, especially if you've listened all the way to the end. I hope this has been a positive discussion, and it'd be great to hear your thoughts, whether in comments below if you're watching this on video, or leaving a comment on the website biggerinside.co.uk in the imaginative discipleship section, or indeed on hitting up on social and so on with your thoughts and comments. I'd love to hear about your experiences, whether this is something that's happening for you, and just how we can be better building this movement of imaginative discipleship, of imaginative engagement as Christians. So I hope this podcast can be part of that as well. And
feel free to hit me up on Twitter.
Yes,
it's just my name.
I think I might have been mispronouncing it. It's you said it. I said Ted Turnau. Is it Ted Turn? What was it?
I answered to both.
Okay.
I answered to both. I was raised with Ted Turnau.
Turnau. Okay.
But in the Czech Republic, if I say that, they misspell my name, so I have to go Ted Turnau.
Okay, I'll try and remember that and get it accurate to your family pronunciation. Great, good stuff. Well, thank you so much for your time, Ted. It's been really fun to explore these things with you, and God bless you with your writing, and perhaps we can get you back on again, and I'm sure I'll be inviting Ruth Naomi Floyd, who's is working on the Imagination Manifesto with you, and has many amazing stories and experiences and insights of her own to share. So I'm sure she'll be a great guest to have at some point in future. So
it has been a privilege, Caleb. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for watching. Please like and share this video, and subscribe to the Imaginative Discipleship YouTube channel. Ta-ra!